following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Leanna Kersner, and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for going good crazy. This week, we're going to talk about a condition that's not officially diagnosed, recognized, whatever you want to call it, in Canada, but it is listed on a lot of Canadian resources about autism. Now, how is this possible? Mental health diagnoses are not based on blood tests or other clearly defined markers, and because what's considered an official condition changes with every new diagnostic and statistical manual, there's room to talk about stuff that hasn't been recognized yet. Furthermore, our current DSM, that's the short form for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, our current DSM is getting a bit old. The DSM-5, yes, we're up to 5, was published in 2013. And we did get a text revision in 2022, but obviously awareness and approaches to mental health have changed a lot in the past 12 years and are continuing to evolve. Anyone who works in the mental health space knows that diagnostic criteria alone isn't enough for good mental health results. We know that each DSM is the product of years of compromise. The average is like 6 years to get one out the door. The thing is, the accepted diagnostic criteria, that's the thing that therapists have to work with for those all-important billing codes. Yes, so people can get paid. We knew that each DSM was flawed when it came out. And most experts agree that in 2025, the DSM-5 is outdated. But it's the best we have until the DSM-6 comes out, and we can all fight about that one all over again, right? Now, there's something unique about the DSM-5, specifically it. One of the more controversial elements of the DSM-5 was the consolidating of 4 different diagnoses surrounding neurodivergency into a single diagnosis of what is now known as autism spectrum disorder. A much more limited definition of autism was combined with Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, also known as Heller's syndrome, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which is shortened to PDD-NOS. And those were the 4 that ended up getting turned into ASD. A 3-level severity assessment scale was also added based on the level of required support. Now, some would say it's 4 levels because none is a level. Some would say that's just being autistic about the severity scale. But anyway, right? The proponents of these changes, the people who agreed with them, said that it streamlined the system, made diagnosis faster, and unlocked more services for more people, which has turned out to be true. You know, they'll see, autism rates are exploding. Well, yeah, that's because more people are getting help, not because there's more autism, right? Now, the critics of these changes, not the ones that are like, autism, vaccines, all that, that's all nonsense, right? The people who are informed but were critical of the changes in the DSM-5, they said that the people at both extremes of the severity scale, those who are very low needs and those who are very high needs, were going to suffer from a lack of support because the categories were too broad. Furthermore, people with moderate needs were going to be flattened to, say somebody has very high needs in one category, next to no needs in another. That gets all flattened out. This has also turned out to be true. So all the proponents of the changes regarding autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5 were right. All the critics of the changes regarding autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5 were right. So what does that mean? It means a lot more people are getting access to services, and that's great. And then there's someone like me who's right on the boundary of a formal autism diagnosis. I get a 71 on the Radzar scale. People are like, what that? Don't worry about it if you don't know. It's borderline bordering on autism. Right? Not borderline personality disorder, a borderline diagnosis. And this is confusing because someone like me, who doesn't have a formal diagnosis, struggles to prove that many of the sensory issues that I have are very real and I can't help them and I can't just tough them out for very long, right? And someone like my guest this week also couldn't get an appropriate diagnosis for her son with a severe subcategory of autistic symptoms. The conditioning question here is called pathological demand avoidance. And while it's recognized in the UK, it's not formally recognized here in Canada. However, anyone who has lived or worked with someone with demand avoidance knows it's very real. Now, what does this sort of look like? Standard, they spend a lot of time sort of scoping you out. I'm talking months, years, right, before they trust you. They engage in very detailed play pretend or role playing. The people with PDA that I work with love AI chatbots, and there's a lot of hate for AI chatbots. But for somebody with PDA, oh, it's an unlocker, okay? Of course, then there's a special interest in sensory differences that come with any autism. But with PDA, there's also the anxiety surrounding control that's central to the condition. Someone with PDA can be having a great day, and they'll do something until someone tells them to do it. The minute there is a demand, the anxiety within someone who has pathological demand avoidance spikes so intensely that they melt down or shut down. Now, this is different from someone with, say, oppositional defiance disorder, which is marked by anger and, as the name says, defiance. Someone with pathological demand avoidance gets a threat response or panic when they're expected to do something. Even something that most of us wouldn't see as a demand, like eating a meal or brushing your teeth or getting dressed. My guest this week has an autistic son with symptoms consistent with pathological demand avoidance. So if this description I just gave sounds like someone you know, including adults, keep listening. Portia Lamb, a lawyer who will be talking to us all the way from Australia. She's the author of The Unlocking, an Autism Story. And Portia's story and the story of her family is amazing. You will be on the edge of your seat. Not literally if you're in the car, right? But stay tuned, even if this doesn't sound like something that describes somebody you know. Some of the stuff you can pick up here, just about communicating and working with people who see things very different from you, navigate life in a very different way. It's awesome. Do you have a story you think would be good for the show? Are you interested in sponsoring the show? Leanna at nottherapyshow.com. Not Therapy Show is the website, nottherapyshow.com. At Not Therapy Show on socials. We will be back with Portia Lamb, unlocking an autism story and pathological demand avoidance when we come back. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. It is time again for the interview. And you guys know I like the stories of people. I love interviewing therapists, but I am not a therapist and I like to talk to other non-therapists in the mental health space. And I have Portia Lamb with me this episode, the author of The Unlocking an Autism Story. It's out this week. And Portia, your story is very, very specific. So welcome to It's Not Therapy. And where do you want to start introducing people to you, you know, your child and your story?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Liana. Well, a quick intro of me would be that I'm a mum of two young children. I've got a 5-year-old daughter and a 6-year-old son. and my son is on the autism spectrum, and he exhibits a certain subtype of autism called pathological demand avoidance, or PDA, which we will talk about a bit later. I'm also a corporate lawyer and have been doing that for the last 18 or 19 years or so, but I took a 3-year career break, basically to be the full-time carer to my son Harry and manage his early intervention therapy, which we did with the hope of getting him school ready. And then I ended up writing this book about our family's experience.
Now, people think they know, oh, they know one kid with autism, and they think they know all of it. But, autistic kids are as diverse as they are kids. But PDA, pathological demand avoidance, is its own thing. And having worked with adults with pathological demand avoidance, it is a very, very challenging condition, made more challenging by there hasn't been a ton of research into it. We know kind of the markers of it, but we don't know quite what causes it. It could be a form of anxiety condition, but in Harry's case, what was going on? It started during COVID lockdown, correct?
Mm. Yes, so I live in Melbourne in Australia, and here in Australia, PDA is not an officially recognised condition. In the UK, you can get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder with a PDA profile.
Mhm.
But in many countries around the world, PDA is not recognised by paediatricians or psychologists or other clinicians. There is, however, this proliferation of parents online who have discovered PDA. So there's a lot in the online communities from this group of parents who say, oh, my kid's got this pattern of behavior. And it ends up that you discover a really quite distinctive pattern of behavior. And that's what draws all these parents together, because they've usually got this autism diagnosis and it doesn't explain the full story. And they go looking around for more answers, more solutions, and eventually, 6 months or a year down the track, they discover this term PDA. And most of us are like, there it is. That's my kid. So for those of you who haven't heard of PDA, the best way that I can describe it, and I borrow a lot from the definition of PDA that was coined by the UK psychologist Elizabeth Newson in the 1980s, who was the first psychologist to do a body of work defining PDA and, some of the strategies that might help PDA kids. And I also add to it some of the insights I've read about from PDA adults who have now, articulated what's going on in their head. And so the working definition that I use for it is that it is an anxiety-driven need for control or autonomy that is often exhibited by avoiding the demands of everyday living or by attempting to take control. So what does that look like? Well, I first noticed these patterns so my son Harry exhibited a lot of the early markers of general autism. There was picky eating, extreme picky eating, inflexibility, sensory aversions, like he could not get a drop of water on his pants. He straight away needed to change his pants. And this was before he was even 1 year old. And he had extreme separation anxiety. And all of that is what you tend to read about in, if I can use the word classical literature on autism. That's probably not the right term, but I think you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had this other pattern of behavior that sat alongside that. And it was where we could not get him to cooperate with anything at any part of the day. So from the time he was sort of 6 months old, we couldn't get him to have a nappy change. We couldn't wash his hair. We couldn't get him dressed, couldn't get him out of bed, couldn't get him back into bed or, down for nap time. And
Mm-hmm.
every time we tried to do one of those transitions or one of those steps in the day, we faced what I now look back on and can see in his little brain was a life or death battle for him. Because when you're at that age, all those acts of self-care, basic getting fed, sleeping, hygiene, health and safety, all of those things are demands, and usually they're done either for you or done to you because you're 1 or 2 and can't do these things for yourself. And I think for him, that was a real infringement on his autonomy, and it felt like a loss of control, even from that really young age. And he perceived that loss of control to be a threat, the way, I might view a threat if someone was running at me with a weapon. And I think he viewed it as that kind of panic. It was a brainstem response, you know, fight, flight, freeze kind of mode. And he would scream, turn purple in the face. You could tell his breathing was just, it was gasp and cry, gasp and cry, tears, frozen to the spot, body was stiff, that kind of thing. And so every, 15 minutes of the day, we would find we needed to do one of these things for him, change his nappy or, change his clothes, put him in the car for something. And we would meet him with this life or death battle, throughout the day. And that's how we saw it. It does change. The pattern of behavior changes as they grow up. So in Harry's case, he doesn't have an intellectual disability, doesn't have a physical disability. He's a completely able-bodied kid. And he is now almost 7 years old. And the way I see his PDA now is not so much in the demand avoidance, but in the attempting to take control, or sometimes what's called equalizing behavior, where he tries to flip the power indifference between being a child and me, the parent, around the other ways. So I often see things like he might stub his toe on a couch and he'll get angry at the couch, but he'll turn around to me and say sorry for the couch. And my initial response to that kind of thing when it first happened, because these behaviors, they come out of nowhere and then it becomes a pattern. It happens, multiple times over the week. I'm like, oh, that's a new thing that's just started now. The first time that happened, I was like, I'm not going to apologize for an inanimate object. And then he's like, say sorry 5 times, say sorry 10 times, because the more I refuse, the more, it feels like a loss of control and there's a greater gap in power and difference. And I could see that he was getting back to that brainstem response. So I've ended up apologizing. I now apologize on behalf of the couch or the table or the wall or whatever it is to get him through that moment of intense panic. And then maybe an hour later, I might try and explain to him why that was not an appropriate thing to ask me to do, or to ask, you can get away with asking your mum, but you can't really ask someone else to do that. So that's kind of what we see these days.
Yeah. And you probably get judgments from everywhere on this because people, if you've never experienced a person who has a demand avoidance, you just think, oh, the kid's a picky eater. And it's not that. There's autistic demand avoidance, which is they don't like, say, tomato skins. And so if there's tomato skins in the food, then they won't eat it. This is something where it can be the absolute most favorite food in the world. If you tell them to eat it, they're not gonna, right? Yeah. And when you said like an hourly battle, I can just imagine how exhausting it must have been, especially during COVID lockdowns, especially when you're dealing with your own sense of instability and control, and everybody was probably pinging off each other in the house, right? Because nobody knew what was going on. What did you do? You said there were online communities you turned to, but there's a lot of conflicting information out there. So what happened next? How did you go from, okay, there's a problem here, to figuring out solutions or a way forward together as a family?
Yeah. So there were a couple of things that we were dealing with which were particularly difficult with Harry. One was his extreme separation anxiety. One was his extreme picky eating. And then there was this demand avoidance. And we had a psychologist a child psychologist that we were seeing, who mentioned PDA. And that was the first time I'd heard of it. She said, I think he has pathologically demand avoidant traits, but don't go look it up and don't go onto the parenting forums.
Interesting.
And, here in Australia, it's not an official diagnosis. I don't think the pediatrician who diagnosed Harry with autism had heard of PDA, or if she had heard of it, I don't know that she believed that it was real, because when I describe these behaviors, it sounds like an exaggeration. It doesn't sound like it's real. And that is, that's the response that I was getting from many clinicians. It was either a blank face or they're like, well, that's not really an official diagnosis here in Australia. We just work with the autism diagnosis.
Mhm.
So in some ways, I was forced into the online space. And even though I do have some criticisms about what happens in those online forums, I first up acknowledge that they were helpful because at least I found a community out there that also had children with these behaviors. And there was like this kind of cross-checking of, yes, we've got that, you've got that too. Okay, we are part of a cohort of autistic kids of parents of autistic kids who have got this really quite marked set of behaviors, and we're not imagining it. And we're also not alone because I felt very alone. I was locked down in the middle of the pandemic, and the traditional professionals dealing with autism weren't recognizing it. So it was really good to find those online communities, which led to the next thing, which was that I threw myself into it and spent hours on the phone just scrolling through. And I scrolled back posts that went like 5 years back, and I was reading through all of them. And the thing that I've discovered is that people tend to gravitate towards those forums when they're in crisis mode and they've got a real problem to share. And so you hear things on the forums like, I've locked myself in the bedroom, my son's kicking down the walls outside. What should I do? Should I call the police? Like, if I call the police, are they going to come arrest him? What's going to happen to him? People are typing these messages out when they're at their absolute worst. But they don't always come back to report on progress or like really good things that happen. So you're getting this not a cross section of the experience. You're getting the really acute bad phase of the experience.
Mhm.
People are coming to it with problems, asking for solutions, but no one's actually reporting back and saying, we tried this and it was really great, it worked. And it kind of took me into a bit of a death spiral. Like I just got sucked in and started catastrophizing. It was really what started out helpful for me to get a couple of strategies and a sense of what other parents were doing quickly turned into this deep, dark hole that sucked me down and made me start worrying about where's my kid going to end up?
Yeah.
If his 2-year-old behavior was taking place out of a 14 or a 15-year-old's body, he would be behind bars because we had a daughter as well. She's only 14 months younger. So we had a kid that was 1 and 2, and we're locked down in the house during the pandemic. And our priority at that stage was trying to keep the two kids safe from one another because Harry had delayed language. Tessa had no language at that point. So frustration levels were high, tolerance levels were low. And he also, at that age, you don't really have a sense of, your ability to hurt someone else. So he would just lash out or he would throw things and it would narrowly miss her, or she'd end up scratched on the face or pushed off someone's lap or whatever it was. And it's very easy to forget that this kid's still only 1 or 2 years old. You've got so much time to find the strategies you need to help them become a functional toddler or school age kid. But at that point in time, I just thought my kid's going to end up behind bars. He's going to end up in an
Yeah.
institution.
Yeah.
And I don't have the skills to look after him, basically. So yeah, I feel like it's easy to get sucked down that path in the online world.
Yeah, there's so much emotion. And when you originally start working with these people and you hear the stories of adults of them like screaming in frustration. And believe it or not, one of the things I find the adults find very helpful is artificial intelligence chatbots. So they can
Mm.
work their frustrations out or try to
Yes.
understand things with somebody who's not real. So they can lash out at the bot or they can do things at the bot. And then I'm like, okay, what did you talk to the bot about? Well, this stuff. Well, that's interesting. And one of the things I've learned through that is there is a sense to it, right? If you sort of follow where they go, you see that thing you talked about, that it's about in an animal, we'd call it a challenge threshold. If you stare at a cat dead in the eyes, it might swat at you. But if you just kind of sit
Right.
and you're good, it's a similar thing, but it just goes the minute something is a demand, the anxiety spikes, the overwhelm hits,
Yes.
and then you get the freeze, fight, fawn, or flight response.
Yes.
And
Yep.
I can completely understand why you would be going, oh my God, what do I do? So let's go to a break and pause and come back and talk about what you did. Because I think this is going to be a resource for people going, okay, this kind of sounds like my kid. And you're, significantly through the other side now. So there is
Yes.
hope, folks. Questions, comments, concerns, Leanna at nottherapyshow.com. At Not Therapy Show is the website, Not Therapy Show on socials. We'll be back with Portia Lamb, author of The Unlocking an Autism Story, when we come back on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking about pathological demand avoidance. What is it? And what do you do if your kid is showing traits of this? I'm here with author all the way from Australia. We worked out the time zones in Melbourne. Portia Lamb, author of The Unlocking an Autism Story. It's out this week. And before the break, Portia, we were talking about sort of the setup. You're in COVID lockdown. You've got this very young son, uh, uh you know, uh, pre-verbal because he was delayed. And then you've got a daughter and you're trying to literally get them to not harm each other. You've got this unofficial idea of what this thing is, this, pathological demand avoidance, but you don't even have the possibility of a diagnosis other than autism. So, I mean, autism treatment is very specific to the kid. And there is some great stuff out there and some not great stuff out there. And that's the thing that makes it so frustrating, right? It's a trial and error
Mm.
thing. It's accessing the services, finding the right fit with someone to work with your son who you love and your whole family, because there are parts that are negotiations, and then there are parts where it's life. There are some things they're just gonna have to do. And the big challenge here is, what do you do when that's precisely what triggers the response, right? So where did you go from there?
Right. So the first thing that happened was, in order to keep our two kids safe from one another, we realized we needed one-on-one
Yeah.
parent to or child to adult ratio. It was not good enough to even have, my husband and I were not confident to have just one of us there looking after both kids. So it was either one of us to each kid or one of us plus a babysitter or a grandparent. And that's how we managed to get through the COVID lockdowns and keep the kids safe. So it meant my husband took 6 months off work to be the primary carer, because I had returned back from maternity leave at this point, and I just felt, after having taken 2 years off, I wasn't prepared to just quit my job and do it. But then we started looking at what kind of early intervention therapies we could do. And up until that point, we had tried, I guess, what you would call first line therapies. We had tried psychology, OT, speech therapy. All of them had some things in there that were helpful, but a lot of it depended upon us, the parents, implementing the strategies in the household. And it just, in reality, that was not working out in our household. And because of Harry's pathological demand avoidance, it became extremely stressful to get him to appointments on time. One of the things you have as a parent of an autistic child is appointments on appointments. Like, they're just appointments, just breed more appointments, right? And getting Harry ready involved like an hour or two before you even get into the car, just to get him dressed, and then to convince him to come out of his room, convince him to get in the car. The car seat, like getting this 2-year-old PDA kid clipped into a car seat, was one of the most challenging, stressful parts of the day. Because if we just pushed him in and clipped the car seat, that immediately caused panic mode, and he was purple in the face, straining against the car seat, just not even able to breathe properly. So we couldn't do that. We had to find, through negotiation and cajoling, like some way to get him to agree to sit in the car seat and get clipped in. So we were spending sort of an hour or two minus the driving time just to get him in the car for the appointments. Then we'd turn up for the appointments and they were 45 minutes long. And then we've got the same thing coming back. So it was really stressful. Then we found out about ABA therapy, which is, it's a different approach. It's time intensive and quite often it's done in your home. The therapists come to your home. And straight away that removes one level of conflict because we don't have to get Harry out of his safe space. The home's his kingdom, right? Like he's got all these toys there. He knows everything around the house. He's comfortable there. So we thought we're going to give this a go, but it's recommended at 20 to 40 hours a week in that early intervention phase. And Harry's separation anxiety meant that someone needed to be with him that whole time. And that's when my husband and I decided to switch roles and I quit my job and I took a career break. It ended up being for 3 years to be basically his support person and his comfort as he sat through this ABA therapy. And look, we didn't really know what it was going to involve when we first started, but we thought if it's unfolding within our home and one of us is there the whole time to watch and monitor and make sure he's happy, it's not really going to go that wrong. Like if it's not the kind of therapy that's right for him, and this is kind of the key bit, like the whole journey of autism and finding an effective support is trial and error. Like even if you find the right therapy, you still then got to find the right therapist to conduct that therapy. The fit has to be right as well. And at least I was going to be there the whole time to monitor and get feedback from Harry about, you know, whether he was happy, whether we were seeing progress, whether there are any side effects. And you should be doing that with any therapy that you engage with your kid, but particularly one where it's that time intensive. I think you want to be getting progress and, you know, seeing that happen. So that's what we ended up doing. And thankfully for us, the therapy that unfolded in our house was all play-based and it was all built around his special interests. So he was really into the Incredible Hulk and then he got really into Harry Potter and the therapists grew with him. They became experts in whatever new special interest area he took on and they came armed with games and toys that reflected those special interests. PDA kids are often really great with role play and like to assume a character, and sometimes they find it easier to perform a demand in character than they do as who they are in real life. So Harry learned a lot of skills being Harry Potter rather than being, you know, Harry, my son. And the therapy that unfolded in our house involved Harry swishing around on a broomstick as he was learning how to clean up the Lego after himself or take turns in a game. Or one of the things that he had to learn was tolerate wearing shoes because we went through 9 months where he would not wear a pair of shoes. And the ABA therapy in this really step-by-step fashion taught him how to wear shoes again, but it was all driven by these special interests. And they approached it by breaking down all these challenges and demands that he couldn't face doing into these really small bite-sized pieces, like, you know, touch a shoe. And then the next day it was like, step your foot into the shoe. 2 days later, it's like, take 2 steps. And so every little increment's tiny, but he gets rewarded each time with all of his special interests and finally wear shoes. And look, it's not a quick process and it's absolutely not a magic pill. I don't want to make it sound like it was a magic pill because it was 3 years of really painstaking work, but it was enjoyable and Harry was engaged most of the time and he picked up these skills that he needed to be independent. And at the end of 3 years, we managed to get him to school and he went to a mainstream school without an aide. And probably most importantly, he has a really good time there. And when I go to pick him up, he's not in a hurry to leave. And for me, that was the goal, to make sure that he was not just able to go to school, like I drop him off and turn around and I don't know what's going on there. Like he's a happy and engaged kid there. We still have a lot of challenges, but I think that, you know, getting him school ready was such a big part of this 3 years that I took off to try and oversee his therapy. And, you know, for us, it was a really positive experience and outcome.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. And I mean it checks every box of what they say works. And it's funny because the idea of turning a need or a demand into, wouldn't it be nice? Like, wouldn't it be good if we can
Yes,
do this? That
yes.
is entering everything from autism to ADHD to all this stuff. It seems like such a simple concept, and yet it's very effective. But meanwhile, this is your full-time job for three
Yes.
years.
Yeah.
You were a professional, and all of a sudden, you're dealing with your own stuff too, right?
I am.
How did you manage that?
Um, that's a difficult question to answer. I think when there's not many parents of special needs kids who come to that job with all the skills they need to do that. And when it first started, I gave up my career. I didn't just give up my career, I gave up my hobbies as well. I mean,
Yeah.
we were in lockdown, so to an extent, I had to give up my hobbies as well. But also, Harry's PDA was really controlling. He also didn't like me talking on the phone. And I know that that's quite a common PDA trait where you're talking to an invisible person on the phone and all your attention is on that conversation, and the PDA just wants to disrupt it and get the attention back. So I didn't even talk to people on the phone, or I'd have to like hide in the car in the driveway to talk to people on the phone. So it was a really isolating experience. How did I get through that? I think, look, it was a rough journey and there are ugly bits, and I talk about that in the book. I won't go into detail about that here.
By the book? Yeah.
But yeah, by the book. But I now see it as a process of learning skills, and I never thought about it as skills. They're soft skills, they're not technical skills like patience and tolerance and compassion. I was a real A-type corporate person. I was all about efficiency. I've never really had anything stop me from being efficient before. And then I had a PDA kid. And so efficiency is out the window because it's all about procrastination and how windy a detour can take to do the task that's required. And when I first, was landed in this role of special needs mum, I didn't have any of those skills, but with practice and exposure, I guess I got them, and I learnt to read my son. And I learnt to read him in a way that no pediatrician or psychologist or ABA therapist or OT could read him, which was the nuances
Mhm.
regarding when I could push him a little bit, because you still do need to push a child. Otherwise,
Mhm.
they're always in the comfort zone. They never learn skills. But you can only ever just push a little bit to what's just beyond their edge. Because if you push too far, that's when meltdowns happen, and it's distressing and traumatic for everyone in the family. But I slowly, and I'm talking about over the course of a few years, slowly learnt those skills on when to read him, when to use role play to help him perform a demand that maybe he found really hard. I learned about all of his special interest characters. And those skills just slowly built up over time. We ended up having a more cooperative relationship. Like a year down the path of when we first got this diagnosis, we were able to find ways to get things done that we hadn't been able to do 12 months earlier. And you don't notice it at the time, because even now, like certain days, we clash about something or multiple things in the day, and it takes me right back, right back
Yeah.
to where I got the diagnosis. It feels like there's been no progress. But actually, if you stop on a good day and reflect, there's so many skills that have been acquired, and the momentum builds. So I
Yeah.
think, there's no shortcut to it. It's trial and error. It's you as a parent learning some skills, them as the child learning some skills, and somehow you close the gap. Like you close the gap by moving it in at both ends, which is how it should be. And I see my role as Harry's mum now to be trying to prepare the world to meet him, but also him to meet the world. And hopefully there is a spot halfway that is an optimal spot for everybody. Accommodations are made where they need to be made, but also Harry learns the skills where he can to be as independent and functional as he possibly can. And that's a moving target all the time because there's always a new skill to learn. And, every now and then there'll be one where I'm like, actually, the gap for that's too big. We need to do more to accommodate him.
Yeah.
Or no, he's, now he's showing signs that he can grasp the skill. So you're always having to assess and evaluate and watch for feedback and side effects of whatever
Yeah.
therapy and strategy you're trying.
Yeah, yeah. If the anxiety gets too high, you can almost get a rebound, and then you got to go
Mm.
back to basics. But Portia Lamb, phenomenal story. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on doing about the best darn half hour on how to meet people where they're at.
Yeah.
How can people find out more about you, the book, and things connected to? Do you have any resources that you recommend on pathological demand avoidance?
Yeah, so I often look towards the UK for information on PDA because that is obviously where it was, most of the work was done. It's officially recognised there. Research into PDA has got some funding that other countries around the world don't. So I use PDA Society, which is a UK organisation for sort of my resources. And when I'm trying to explain PDA to teachers or, other educators that Harry has contact with, they've got a printout that you can use with some brief notes on PDA and approaches that are helpful. So PDA Society is my recommended resource. To connect with me, I've got a website, portialamb.com. You can also find me on Instagram or LinkedIn as Portia Lamb. And the book is called The Unlocking an Autism Story, out on the 25th of February. You can get it at all major online retailers.
All right, Portia, thank you so much for coming on and telling what's a harrowing but ultimately a really, really heartwarming story. The fact that you guys have
Thank
come up,
you.
then he's in school and being a wizard, and that's awesome.
Thanks so much for that, Liana.
When we come back, some pointers just to round off the show, kind of contextualize the amazing story we just heard. Again, Portia Lamb, author of The Unlocking an Autism Story, out in stores right now. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, especially questions about this particular episode, Leanna@nottherapyshow.com is my email. Nottherapyshow.com is my website. @NotTherapyShow is socials. We do regular Monday mantras and Wednesday wisdom on our social media. When we come back, a wrap up on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back in It's Not Therapy. I'm still Leanna Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and we are still talking pathological demand avoidance, an unrecognized condition in Canada for now. I suspect this is one that's going to get many, many more supports as people become more aware of the condition. Now, what do you do if you or your child have a mental health condition that is not yet recognized where you're listening right now? Well, the nice thing about mental health conditions is there's no blood test, right? It's not like, oh, you have to take insulin or another medication for diabetes. It's not like you need blood pressure medication. A lot of this stuff is cognitive behavioral therapy or a similar kind of talk therapy or behavior modification. So there are things you can do. First off, this may sound surprising, but really it's not. Please seek a diagnosis. Even if it's not specific, a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder severity 3 isn't very specific, but it's very important to rule out other conditions. A lot of psychological conditions and neurodivergencies can look similar, but they function very differently with very different treatment protocols. And don't be surprised that you'll get one, diagnosis or temporary diagnosis, working diagnosis, you start working on it a bit, it turns out to be wrong and you have to change gears. It's frustrating, But this is the reality of our current system. This is the reality of working with the brain. Preliminary diagnoses tend to be wrong. Okay, and that's why it's really important to use your compassion with others and with yourself. Go easy, like the Adele song. What works for others isn't necessarily going to work for you. And what works for you isn't a guarantee for other people. I personally had a very bad reaction to EMDR therapy, but it works great for other people, and that's amazing. That's why there's different treatments for different types of people. Use online resources, including forums and Facebook groups, as resources, not authorities. Don't follow the advice of Dr. TikTok, okay? There's some great stuff out there, but there are also the crunchy moms. You know, the ones who insist a natural lifestyle without processed foods, technology, or modern medicine is best for their kids? On the internet, yeah. When you come up against something that seems too good to be true or seems like a contradiction, like advocating a no-tech lifestyle on something you're reading on your smartphone, yeah, trust that instinct, right? Mental health TikTok's great. I am on it. But use your critical thinking, okay? And trust your instincts. But also, you're gonna find a lot of scary stuff put out there by people like the crunchy moms. Don't get scared by terms, okay? Like I said off the top, mental health terminologies have gone through a decades-long period of consolidation. So terms like ABA therapy that Portia mentioned, they get attacked online really badly. One person called it to me conversion therapy for autistics, okay? All applied behavioral analysis, that's what ABA stands for. Applied behavioral analysis means that a practitioner will work with your kid one-on-one to encourage things that help and discourage things that harm. Emphasis on encourage, not force, because it's a one-on-one process. Some do it in small groups, but the standard practice is one-on-one. There's going to be great experiences. And there's also going to be horrible experiences because it's one-on-one. So don't be afraid to give stuff like this a chance. There's no medications. You're not putting anything in your kid's body, and you can be there. Just, again, trust your instincts and trust your knowledge of your kid. All right, and I am out of time for this week. I really enjoyed this. Portia's such a great speaker. Check out her book. Check out some of the other books. Go to Podbean. Check out past episodes if it's not therapy. NotTherapyShow.com. Leanna at NotTherapyShow.com. Because conversations with regular people is my favorite part of doing this job. Until next time, you're crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Talk soon.